The Pope did not send an army. He built one. He recruited men who had surrendered every earthly allegiance they had ever held, bound them with a vow of obedience so absolute it placed them outside the jurisdiction of any king or bishop or court on earth, and then trained them not in combat but in the specific art of making powerful men trust them. Then he deployed them across 5 continents with a single instruction: go where the church is losing, get inside the courts and the classrooms and the confessionals, and do not come back until it is won. This is the story of the Jesuits, and the question that has haunted their critics for 5 centuries is not whether they were dangerous. It is how men with no weapons, no land, and no money got further inside the machinery of global power than anyone with all 3. In 1540, a small group of men knelt in a Roman church and promised God 3 things: poverty, chastity, and obedience. No property, no family, no will of their own. By most reasonable assessments, this should have made them irrelevant. It did not. Within a generation, these men were whispering in the confessional booths of French kings. Within 2 generations, they were teaching the children of every major European dynasty, shaping the minds of boys who would grow up to reshape the world. René Descartes sat in their classrooms. Voltaire sat in their classrooms, which is almost impressively awkward in retrospect. Their astronomers were calculating the Chinese imperial calendar in Beijing. Their mapmakers were sketching rivers in Paraguay that no European cartographer had ever dreamed of. All of this carried out by men who were not, technically, allowed to own so much as a spare pair of boots. This is the paradox at the heart of the Society of Jesus, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. Picture the dormitory at the Collegio Romano sometime around 1560. Candles burning low, beeswax in cold stone air, the scratch of quills moving across paper in near total silence. These are trained men. Not passionate men, not inspired men, trained men, the way a blade is trained to an edge. They are writing letters, hundreds of them, to be carried by ship and mule and sheer human stubbornness to every corner of the known world and several corners that weren't known yet. They own nothing. They answer to one man, their superior general in Rome, who answers to one other man, the Pope. The chain of command is exactly 2 links long, and both links are made of iron. How does something like this happen? How do you build the most sophisticated soft power operation in early modern history out of a vow of total poverty? The honest answer is that poverty, wielded correctly, is not a weakness. It is a weapon. A Jesuit priest arriving at a royal court owned nothing, owed nothing to no local lord, no family estate, no title or inheritance. He was beholden to no faction except his own order. In a world where every advisor came trailing the heavy luggage of political obligation, a man who appeared to want nothing was either deeply suspicious or extraordinarily useful. Usually both. And the obedience. Let's not breeze past the obedience. Ignatius of Loyola, the Spanish soldier who founded the whole enterprise, once wrote that a true Jesuit should be like a corpse in the hands of his superior, moldable, directionless on his own, infinitely directable by someone else. That is either a description of profound spiritual surrender or an extraordinarily effective management philosophy. Probably both. The men who built this organization were not mystics dreaming in quiet gardens. They were survivors. Soldiers. Men who had seen what the Protestant Reformation was doing to the Catholic Church across Europe and decided that prayer alone was not going to be sufficient. what it would take, they understood, was education and access and patience. We should talk about where that idea came from. On the 20th of May, 1521, a French cannonball passed through the walls of the citadel at Pamplona and shattered the right leg of a 30-year-old Basque soldier who had been having, by all accounts, a very good war until that moment. His name was Inigo Lopez de Loyola, and he was not a man accustomed to inconvenience. Before the cannonball, Ignatius, as history would come to call him, was precisely the kind of man you might find swaggering through a Spanish court. Fine clothes, strong opinions about his own appearance, a gift for brawling that had already earned him at least one criminal charge. He was vain in the particular way of men who have been told too often that they are remarkable. He dueled. He gambled. He pursued women with a persistence that the later church would describe diplomatically as worldly entanglements. He was, in short, not obviously saint material. Then the cannonball arrived and rearranged his priorities. The leg was set badly. Badly enough that Ignatius, lying in the family castle at Loyola during a recovery that stretched into months, noticed that the bone had healed crooked and that one leg now sat shorter than the other. This would ruin the line of his breeches. He asked the surgeons to re-break it and reset it. They did. Without anesthesia, because this was 1521 and the concept of mercy had not yet been fully refined. He did not reportedly cry out. He was that committed to his tailoring. The second recovery was longer. Bedridden, bored, and in the specific misery of a man who has recently had his leg deliberately broken for cosmetic reasons, Ignatius asked for something to read. He wanted romance novels, the popular literature of his day, stories of chivalry and adventure and beautiful women in distress. The castle had none. What it had were lives of the saints and a life of Christ. He read them, presumably with some resentment at first. And then something happened in that quiet room, with the smell of wood smoke and the low ache of a healing bone and nothing outside the window but Basque hills going gray in the afternoon. He started to find the saints more interesting than the knights. Not immediately. Not in a blinding flash. But slowly, the way a cold room warms, he began to notice that thinking about spiritual things left him feeling settled in a way that thinking about court life did not. He was, without entirely meaning to, having a conversion experience. The most consequential accident in Catholic history had been caused by a French artillery crew and a shortage of good fiction. By the following year, he was at Montserrat, a monastery carved into a mountain in Catalonia, the stone walls breathing cold and incense. He knelt before the Black Madonna, a carved statue dark with centuries of candle smoke, and he hung his sword on the altar. The soldier was formally done. What replaced him was considerably more dangerous. Next, we meet that replacement, the gaunt, limping pilgrim who turned spiritual obsession into a system, and who found that the church he wanted to save was not entirely sure it wanted his help. On the last day of October 1517, a German theology professor nailed a document to a church door in Wittenberg and accidentally ended the medieval world. Martin Luther's 95 Theses were not at first glance revolutionary. They were an academic complaint, the kind of dense Latin argument that usually circulated among scholars and promptly died of boredom. But the printing press was new, and Germans were irritable, and within 2 weeks copies were circulating across the Holy Roman Empire. Within 2 months, all of Europe had read them. Within a decade, half of Christendom had left the building. The speed was the thing that stunned Rome. Protestantism didn't spread like a rumor. It spread like a fire in a paper warehouse. By the 1520s, Luther had followers in Germany, Scandinavia, and Switzerland. Calvin was building his own theological fortress in Geneva. Henry VIII was making convenient theological discoveries in England that happened to align perfectly with his desire for a new wife. The map of Christian Europe, so tidy for 1,000 years, was fracturing along fault lines that had been there all along, invisible beneath centuries of assumed unity. Rome's response was, to put it charitably, inadequate. The old monastic orders, the Benedictines and the Franciscans and the Dominicans, had once been the Church's great reform engines. But by the 16th century, many monasteries had become comfortable. Extremely comfortable. The smell of a wealthy abbey in this period, if you happened to wander through, would have been roasting meat and beeswax candles and the particular warmth of an institution that had not felt urgency in a very long time. These were not men built for crisis. Then came 1527, and the crisis arrived in person. The troops of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, unpaid and therefore extremely motivated, sacked Rome. For 8 months, soldiers camped in the Vatican. Pope Clement VII hid in the Castel Sant'Angelo while his city was dismantled around him. The psychological wound was profound. If God's city on earth could be looted by a supposedly Catholic emperor's mercenary army, something had gone catastrophically wrong with the entire arrangement. The papacy that emerged from 1527 was a humiliated institution in a fractured world, surrounded by aging religious orders that offered comfort but not answers, facing a Protestant movement that was sharp, passionate, and organized. What the Church needed was something entirely new. Something mobile, educated, and absolutely ruthless in its devotion. It needed, though it didn't know it yet, the limping pilgrim who was currently wandering toward Paris with holes in his shoes and a head full of dangerous ideas. On the morning of August 15, 1534, 7 men climbed a hill outside Paris and changed the world before breakfast. The hill was Montmartre. The occasion was the feast of the Assumption of Mary. The chapel was small, underground, carved into the rock, the kind of space that smells permanently of cold stone and extinguished candles. 7 men knelt in that dimness and made vows of poverty, chastity, and pilgrimage to Jerusalem. It was quiet. It was private. No pope witnessed it. No cardinal blessed it. Just 7 men and the flickering dark. How had Ignatius of Loyola, the limping Basque soldier turned pilgrim, assembled these 7? At the University of Paris, slowly and with considerable social difficulty. He arrived in 1528, nearly 40 years old, learning Latin grammar alongside boys half his age who found him faintly ridiculous. He didn't mind. Ignatius had already spent years re-engineering himself from the inside out, and he had a tool for doing exactly that. He called it the Spiritual Exercises. It was a manual, precise and almost clinical, for reshaping the human mind through 4 weeks of structured meditation and imaginative prayer. You were asked to smell the sulfur of hell, to hear the screams, to feel the heat, then to turn and imagine the face of Christ with equal vividness. Modern readers sometimes compare it to cognitive behavioral therapy with significantly higher stakes. Ignatius walked his companions through those exercises one by one, and one by one they emerged from the process looking at the world differently. Among them, Francis Xavier, a charming Navarrese aristocrat who would eventually carry Christianity to India and Japan and die on the edge of China. Peter Faber, a gentle Savoyard whom historians consistently call the best of them, the one people actually liked. These were not men gathered by accident. The Montmartre vow bound them informally. What made them official was patience, because Rome moved slowly, and then it moved decisively. On September 27, 1540, Pope Paul III signed the bull Regimini Militantis Ecclesiae, roughly translating to the governance of the Church Militant, and the Society of Jesus formally existed. The name was almost provocative. Not the Society of Mary, not the Brothers of something humble. The Society of Jesus, as though they had gone straight to the top. The document included something unprecedented. A fourth vow, taken only by the fully professed members, binding them to special obedience to the Pope himself. Not to a local bishop, not to a regional superior. Directly to Rome. On any mission, to any place, at any time, without question. Think about what that meant in 1540, when Protestantism was reorganizing half of Europe and the papacy was still rebuilding its confidence after the catastrophe of 1527. The Pope now had an order that answered only to him, could be sent anywhere, and was trained to argue, teach, preach, and persuade with exhausting sophistication. The Church had spent decades looking for something new. It had found something that had never existed before. The question now was what, exactly, to do with it. The Ratio Studiorum arrived in 1599 as a document of roughly 467 rules, and it was, in the most polite sense possible, a complete takeover of European intellectual life disguised as a school handbook. Here is the core Jesuit insight that most military strategists somehow missed. If you want to shape a civilization, skip the throne room. Find the children who will one day sit in it. The Jesuit college system was not assembled quietly. By 1626, there were over 440 Jesuit schools operating across Europe, Asia, and the Americas. 440. For context, the entire university system of medieval Europe had taken centuries to produce a fraction of that number. The Jesuits did it in roughly 70 years, and they did it with a curriculum so standardized you could walk out of a college in Palermo and into one in Prague and find the same texts on the same shelves, the same Latin exercises on the same desks, the same slightly exhausted teacher explaining Cicero for the 47th time that week. The Ratio Studiorum blended classical rhetoric, philosophy, mathematics, theology, and humanist literature into a single unified course of study. Students debated publicly, memorized extensively, and wrote constantly. The air in a Jesuit classroom smelled of ink and chalk dust, and during public disputations, what one might diplomatically call competitive anxiety. The method was rigorous in the way that only something designed by former soldiers who had reinvented themselves as scholars could be. Now here is where the strategy gets almost admirably cynical. Jesuit education was free. Completely free. At a time when educating a child meant either private tutors for the wealthy or nothing much at all for everyone else, the Jesuits opened their doors to the sons of dukes and the sons of cobblers and taught them side by side. This was not incidental generosity. It was policy. An educated poor student owed the Jesuits his formation. An educated aristocrat owed them something potentially more useful: loyalty, influence, and proximity to power. The results were not subtle. René Descartes studied at La Fleche under Jesuit teachers and spent the rest of his life trying to think his way out of assumptions they had installed in him. Molière learned his rhetoric at the Collège de Clermont and used it to write comedies that made Paris laugh until it cried. And then there is Voltaire, which is a particular kind of irony that deserves a moment of appreciation. Voltaire, the Enlightenment's sharpest critic of institutional religion, the man who wanted to crush the church and said so in memorable French, spent 5 years at the Collège Louis-le-Grand under Jesuit instruction. He hated them for decades. He attacked them in pamphlets, in letters, in fiction. He never stopped quoting them. You can measure Jesuit education by its enemies as much as its disciples. This was the subversive mathematics of the classroom as battlefield. You do not need to win every argument in the present tense. You need to build the minds that will conduct all future arguments, set their vocabulary, calibrate their assumptions, teach them what questions are worth asking. A generation raised inside Jesuit epistemology would debate ferociously and in good Latin, and always within a certain invisible framework the Jesuits had quietly assembled around them. Control the education of the ruling class, and you control the next generation's ceiling. Voltaire tore at the walls his entire life and built them slightly higher by doing so. It was, depending on your sympathies, either the most sophisticated long game in the history of Western institutions, or a deeply uncomfortable reminder that good schooling and directed schooling are not always the same thing. Probably both. The Jesuits were not only building schools in Europe, of course. While Paris and Prague and Palermo were filling classrooms, other members of the society were boarding ships, carrying that same disciplined formation toward coasts that had never heard a word of Latin. Francis Xavier had already pointed the way. Others were following into territory that would test every principle the Ratio Studiorum had ever tried to instill. Father François de la Chaise knelt beside Louis XIV for over 30 years, which is, by any measure, an extraordinarily long time to be whispering in the ear of the most powerful man in Europe. The royal confessor occupied a position that had no real equivalent in modern life. Imagine your therapist, your priest, your political advisor, and your oldest friend compressed into a single black-robed figure who met with you privately, regularly, and under conditions of absolute canonical secrecy. Kings confessed everything. Their adulteries, their doubts about a pending war, their hatred of a particular minister, their secret terror that God was watching and unimpressed. The confessor heard it all, said nothing, and then walked back into the palace where he lived, ate at court tables, and spoke with everyone. The impossibility of the position was almost elegant. The seal of confession was absolute. A Jesuit confessor could not reveal what he had heard without committing a grave sin, which meant that every Protestant pamphleteer in Europe was technically correct that the Jesuits knew everything, and also completely unable to prove it. The conspiracy theories practically wrote themselves. The Jesuits were pulling the strings of the Habsburgs in Vienna, the Bourbons in Paris, the Wittelsbachs in Munich. Every Catholic monarch of any significance had one nearby, a quiet man in dark cloth who smiled pleasantly and forgot nothing. Father de la Chaise, whose name lives on in the most famous cemetery in Paris through a coincidence of real estate, was confessor to Louis XIV from 1675 until 1909. Correction. Until 1709, which illustrates how long this reign actually was. He served through the king's most consequential religious decisions, including the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685, which stripped French Protestants of the legal protections they had held for nearly 90 years. Around 200,000 Huguenots fled France. The economy noticed. The diplomatic community noticed. The Jesuits were blamed, loudly, by nearly everyone outside France and a significant number inside it. Did de la Chaise advise the revocation? Almost certainly he had opinions. Whether he expressed them in confession or in conversation is a distinction the historical record declines to clarify, which is exactly the problem with the entire institution. Proximity was the power. You did not need to issue orders if you were the last voice the king heard before he made a decision. Protestant Europe's fury was understandable, if occasionally overheated. The image of Jesuit puppet masters coordinating Catholic policy across the continent through a network of confessionals had a certain satisfying geometry to it. It was also, in the way of most satisfying conspiracy theories, simultaneously exaggerated and not entirely wrong. The Jesuits did not control Catholic monarchs. They simply knew them completely in the way that only a confessor can, and then remain nearby while history was made. That kind of influence does not announce itself. It accumulates quietly in palace corridors that smell of beeswax candles and stone floors and the particular hush of a room where someone important has just finished speaking the truth. It was, one might say, a long game. And the Jesuits had a great deal of practice playing those. Francis Xavier arrived in Goa in 1542 wearing the same threadbare cassock he had traveled in for 13 months, and by most accounts smelling precisely like it. The Jesuits had discovered something that no previous religious order had quite committed to in the same way. The world was large, souls were everywhere, and a man with a letter of introduction and a very high tolerance for discomfort could reach almost all of them. Xavier became the proof of concept. He moved through Goa, then the Malay Peninsula, then Japan, baptizing, preaching, and writing letters back to Rome in a state of barely contained wonder. His correspondence described Shinto temples with the curiosity of someone who genuinely wanted to understand them and the theological alarm of someone who very much did not approve. He died in 1552 on a small island off the coast of China, trying to arrange entry into the last empire he had not yet attempted. He was 46. He had covered roughly 56,000 miles. The Society of Jesus counted this, correctly, as a success. Matteo Ricci took a different approach. Where Xavier moved fast, Ricci slowed down. He arrived in China in 1582, spent decades learning Mandarin to a degree of elegance that impressed Chinese scholars, adopted the silk robes of a Confucian gentleman, and eventually secured a permanent residence in Beijing at the court of the Wanli Emperor. He brought clocks, maps, and mathematical instruments. He demonstrated that the Church of Rome knew where China was on a globe, which was, diplomatically speaking, a reasonable opening. The emperor found him useful and entertaining. Ricci found the emperor's archive invaluable. The reports flowing back to Rome from that single address were extraordinary. This was the Jesuits' underappreciated genius. They were, in the modern sense, ethnographers. Their missionaries learned languages, mapped coastlines, documented customs, and sent everything home in meticulous dispatches. The archives in Rome accumulated knowledge of cultures that Europe would not otherwise encounter for another century. In Paraguay, the Jesuit reductions created something stranger still. Dozens of self-governing indigenous communities, organized, prosperous, and technically outside the authority of the Spanish colonial administration. European philosophers read descriptions of them with the nervous excitement of people encountering an idea they cannot quite categorize. Critics called them a Jesuit empire within an empire. That was not entirely inaccurate. What emerges from all of this, whether Beijing or Asuncion or the island where Xavier died cold and alone, is the outline of a single coherent institution operating simultaneously across 5 continents, reporting to one address in Rome. Which raises an obvious question, and one that Europe was beginning to ask rather loudly. Blaise Pascal was not a man prone to understatement, which made him extremely dangerous. In 1656, the French mathematician and philosopher published the first of his provincial letters, a series of pamphlets attacking Jesuit moral theology with the precision of someone who had spent considerable time sharpening the knife. Pascal's specific target was a doctrine called probabilism, which held, roughly, that if a reputable theologian had argued a given action was permissible, a confessor could absolve it, regardless of competing opinions. The Jesuits had refined this into something their critics described as moral flexibility and their enemies described as a system for letting the wealthy sin on a technicality. Pascal described it as rather worse than that, in elegant, devastating French that the entire literate public could read and enjoy. The letters sold immediately and continuously. They are still in print. The Jesuits never quite recovered the reputation Pascal removed from them. This was the Jansenist Front, a theological civil war within Catholicism itself, bitter and bookish and genuinely vicious. But the philosophies of the Enlightenment were a different problem entirely. Voltaire had attended a Jesuit school and retained a complicated alumni relationship with the order, which is to say he spent much of his adult life mocking it. To the philosophies, the Jesuits represented everything the Enlightenment was arguing against: institutional secrecy, intellectual control, loyalty to Rome over loyalty to reason. They became a symbol. Symbols are harder to defend against than arguments. Portugal, however, skipped the philosophical stage and went straight to catastrophe. On the 1st of November, 1755, the Lisbon earthquake killed somewhere between 10,000 and 100,000 people, collapsed most of the city, and generated a tsunami that finished what the shaking started. The Marquis de Pombal, Portugal's chief minister and a man of extraordinary administrative ruthlessness, was rebuilding Lisbon before the smoke cleared. He was also simultaneously constructing a case against the Jesuits. When a failed assassination attempt against King Joseph I was traced, through genuinely selective evidence, to noble families with Jesuit connections, Pombal moved. In 1759, Portugal expelled every Jesuit from its territory and its empire. Ships arrived in Italian ports carrying confused priests with almost no warning and no clear destination. The cascade followed with the grim momentum of a domino demonstration. France expelled the Society in 1764, after years of parliamentary opposition and a spectacular colonial bankruptcy scandal that the Jesuits were blamed for, not entirely fairly. Spain followed in 1767, with King Charles III expelling thousands of Jesuits from Spain and every Spanish territory in a single coordinated overnight operation. The secrecy that had once protected them now looked like evidence. By 1773, Pope Clement XIV, under sustained pressure from the Bourbon monarchies, suppressed the Society of Jesus entirely. The army the papacy had built to reconquer Europe had become, in the eyes of Europe's Catholic monarchs, the most inconvenient institution on the continent. Which, as endings go, is a remarkable one. Though, as it happens, it was not quite the ending. On July 21st, 1773, Pope Clement XIV sat in a room that had grown very quiet and signed a document that erased 233 years of institutional history. The brief was called Dominus Ac Redemptor. It took less paper than you might expect to destroy the most powerful religious order in Catholic history. Clement had been avoiding this moment for 4 years. The Bourbon monarchies, Spain, France, Portugal, Naples, all of them had made the calculation simple. Suppress the Jesuits or face consequences that a weakened papacy could not afford to ignore. They called it a diplomatic request. It had the texture of an ultimatum. Clement stalled, negotiated, prayed, and stalled again, reportedly telling a cardinal that the pressure was killing him. He was not speaking metaphorically. He knew what this would cost. He said it plainly to multiple witnesses. "This suppression will be my death." He signed anyway. The document went out across the Catholic world with the speed that only catastrophic news seems to travel. Overnight, in city after city, Jesuit schools fell silent. Missions that had operated for generations in South America, Asia, and Africa were seized before the ink was dry on the order's dissolution. Libraries were inventoried. Property was transferred. In some locations, soldiers arrived at the doors. The transition from active institution to erased memory took, in practical terms, a matter of weeks. Centuries of accumulated infrastructure, classrooms, observatories, printing presses, charitable operations, simply changed hands. The neighbors moved in. The name came down. And then there was Lorenzo Ricci. Ricci was the superior general of the Society of Jesus, the last man to hold the title in the original order, and the man who arguably had the worst summer of 1773 in the entire Catholic world, which is saying something. He was arrested and transported to the Castel Sant'Angelo, the fortress on the Tiber that Rome had always used for problems it did not want to look at directly. He was not charged with a specific crime. He was not tried. He was simply kept in a building that smelled of stone and river damp, while the institution he led was methodically dismantled outside the walls. Ricci spent 2 years in the Castel Sant'Angelo insisting, to anyone who would record it, that the Society of Jesus had done nothing to merit suppression. He was not angry, by most accounts. He was precise. He maintained, formally and repeatedly, that the order was innocent of the charges implied by its dissolution. He died in the castle in November of 1775 without ever being told what exactly he had been imprisoned for. History has not improved on the irony of this. The man who led the Jesuits died in the same building that popes had once retreated to for protection, which is either poetic or simply grim, depending on how charitable you are feeling. Clement XIV did not survive to appreciate the symmetry. He died in September of 1774, 14 months after signing Dominus Ac Redemptor, exactly as he had predicted. His health had been declining for years, but the timing was striking enough that rumors circulated immediately. Poison, some said. Divine judgment, said others. The more plausible explanation is that Clement was an old, exhausted man who had spent years under extraordinary pressure and finally ran out of the capacity to continue. He had said the suppression would kill him. It did. The least you can say for him is that he was accurate. The Society of Jesus was gone. The schools were empty, the missions transferred, the superior general dead in a fortress. The army the popes had built to reconquer Europe had been dissolved at the pope's own hand, under pressure from the very monarchs it had once been tasked with supporting. Institutions do not simply disappear, however, even when they are formally erased. The former Jesuits went somewhere. Their ideas went somewhere. Their networks, their students, their accumulated knowledge, all of it scattered into the world like seeds from a broken pod. And in one place, almost comically, the Society of Jesus never suppressed at all, because the local rulers simply refused to cooperate with Rome's decision. That place was the Russian Empire. Catherine the Great had no particular love for the Catholic Church, which made her one of the most useful friends the Jesuits ever had. When Dominus Ac Redemptor arrived in St. Petersburg in 1773, Catherine read it, set it down, and effectively ignored it. Her reasoning was not theological. It was practical, which is its own kind of ruthless. The Jesuit schools operating in the newly acquired territories of White Russia were producing educated administrators, trained doctors, and competent engineers. Catherine was building an empire. She was not going to dismantle her own infrastructure because a beleaguered pope in Rome was having a difficult political season. So the schools stayed open. The Jesuits kept teaching. And in the city of Polotsk, in what is now Belarus, the Society of Jesus continued to exist in a state that had no official name and no canonical standing, quietly outlasting its own suppression by decades. Frederick the Great of Prussia made the same decision by a different road. Frederick was Protestant, a skeptic, and one of Voltaire's closest correspondents, which means he spent considerable time exchanging witty letters with a man who found organized religion faintly ridiculous. He was not, by any reasonable definition, a natural Jesuit patron. And yet, when the suppression order came, Frederick declined to enforce it, citing the same reason as Catherine. The Jesuit schools were simply too good to replace. He is reported to have said with characteristic economy that he would not destroy his best educational institutions to satisfy the politics of foreign monarchies. Voltaire, to his credit, apparently found this funny. And so for 41 years, the Society of Jesus existed as a ghost. Officially dissolved. Practically operational. The Jesuits in Polotsk trained novices, maintained their constitutions, and kept records. A quiet institutional flame cupped against a very long wind. The Restoration, when it finally came, arrived wrapped in catastrophe. Napoleon had spent roughly 15 years demonstrating what happened to European stability without strong institutions to anchor it. Pope Pius VII, who had watched the French Revolutionary period dismantle the Church's temporal power with remarkable efficiency, drew the obvious conclusion. On August 7, 1814, he issued Solicitudo Omnium Ecclesiarum and restored the Society of Jesus in full. The Jesuits had outlasted the decree that erased them. They had survived in the only two countries in Europe whose rulers were sensible enough or indifferent enough to ignore Rome's instructions. The ghost had kept its records. The flame had stayed lit. Which meant that when the doors opened again, they were ready. They are almost always ready. That preparedness, and what they did with it in the century that followed, is a story that gets considerably more complicated. By 1880, the Jesuits were running 177 colleges across 5 continents, and they were just getting started. The restored society moved fast. Georgetown had been founded in 1789, technically before the suppression even ended, a small act of institutional optimism in a new republic that was not entirely sure what to do with Catholics. Fordham followed in 1841. By the 20th century, 27 Jesuit colleges operated in the United States alone, forming a quiet lattice of influence across American professional life, training lawyers, senators, judges, and at least one director of the Central Intelligence Agency. The buildings smelled of old wood and ambition, which are not always different things. In Latin America, the Jesuit model took a turn that would have startled Ignatius considerably. The 20th century produced liberation theology, a movement that looked at the grinding poverty of millions and decided that the Gospels had something specific to say about it. Jesuit priests in El Salvador, Brazil, and Nicaragua were not writing treatises in comfortable libraries. They were working in barrios, organizing communities, and occasionally being assassinated for it. 6 Jesuit priests were murdered at the University of Central America in San Salvador in 1989 by a military unit trained, with some irony, at an institution funded by the United States government. The Church found this complicated. Rome found this very complicated. The Jesuits found that discomfort had always been part of the job. Don't worry. It gets more unexpected. In 2013, the College of Cardinals elected Jorge Mario Bergoglio of Buenos Aires as Pope. He took the name Francis. He was 76 years old, the first Pope from the Americas, the first from the Southern Hemisphere, and the first Jesuit in roughly 2,000 years of papal history. He is also the first Pope to have worked as a nightclub bouncer, which is perhaps the most purely Jesuit resume entry imaginable. Theological rigor plus practical experience managing unruly crowds. The election sent a particular kind of ripple through historians of the society, because the Jesuits were founded explicitly to serve the Pope without becoming one. The fourth vow, the special obedience to the pontiff, presupposed a certain distance. Now the distance had collapsed entirely. The Pope was the Jesuit. And yet, the deeper legacy of the society may be something more diffuse. Look at the architecture of modern elite influence, and the Jesuit fingerprints are everywhere, sublimated into secular form. The pipeline from prestigious university to policy institution to positions of quiet, durable power. The emphasis on forming leaders rather than masses. The long game, played across generations rather than news cycles. Modern think tanks did not read the Jesuit constitutions and take notes. They didn't have to. The model had already seeped into the groundwater of how ambitious institutions organize themselves. The Society of Jesus set out in 1540 to be a mobile, educated, adaptable force that could go anywhere and outlast almost anything. 5 centuries later, the evidence suggests they were not wrong about themselves. Which raises one final question worth sitting with as the candle burns low. The quill scratching on parchment is almost gone now, replaced by the soft click of keyboards in climate-controlled offices. But the logic underneath has not changed at all. Consider what the Jesuits actually built. Not cathedrals. Not armies. Not treasure fleets. They built a method, a repeatable, portable, deeply patient system for shaping the way human beings understand reality. The confession booth was not just a piece of furniture. It was an intelligence apparatus and a counseling room and a relationship, compressed into a wooden box the size of a wardrobe. The classroom was not just a room. It was a slow-motion intervention in how a young mind orders the world. The silence that fell after a well-placed question was not empty. It was the whole point. What the Jesuits understood, and what took everyone else considerably longer to figure out, is that the most durable power does not announce itself. It arrives in the form of an education, a habit of thought, a way of framing problems that feels like common sense because someone installed it there 20 years ago. Propaganda is loud and expires quickly. Formation is quiet and lasts a lifetime. The difference is the difference between a bonfire and a hearth. Imagine the patience required. Not planning for next year, or the next election, or even the next decade. Planning for the shape of minds a generation from now. That kind of ambition is either visionary or unsettling depending on where you sit. And here is the question that tends to linger, the one worth carrying out of this chapter and into the uncomfortable brightness of the present. Who is doing this now? Which institutions are playing the long game, forming the people who will form the frameworks, funding the schools that produce the thinkers who produce the policies that feel, by the time they arrive, like obvious conclusions? The Jesuits were not secret because they hid. They were secret because most people were not asking the right questions. The tension has never really resolved itself. Education and indoctrination share a border that is easier to draw on paper than to locate in a living classroom. Influence and manipulation look identical from the outside until you examine who benefits. Transparency and effectiveness have always been, at minimum, awkward roommates. The Society of Jesus spent 5 centuries threading that needle. They understood, perhaps better than anyone, that the real war for the future is not fought on fields. It is fought in the long, quiet interval between a teacher asking a question and a student, decades later, believing they already knew the answer. The candle is burning low. The parchment is full. The silence, as always, speaks for itself.